Hello and welcome to the 2024 MIFF Schools program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On behalf of MIFF, we believe in celebrating the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the film texts to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCA, and to subjects such as English, EAL, Literature, Media Studies, and to the Film Study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those courses, there is this key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts. And this is obviously a key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. And so for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not necessarily as a replacement or a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements. While the MIFF Schools program is ideally suited to students within French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and German language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. And so given the importance of visual literacy across a range of subjects, I'd recommend that prior to attending the screening, that teachers introduce or revise some key terminology and film techniques to outline the elements of the text that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, films are fun, but there's also an expectation that they'll be analysing those films, whether as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, Media or Film Studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but a general overview of film techniques would be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether on YouTube or in textbook form. But I would also emphasize from the outset that it's crucially important that students can first identify the technique, secondly, that they can understand its general function in creating meaning within the film, and thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge and that terminology to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film is exploring. And it's really difficult to achieve that final outcome unless the first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, so the use, for example, of a close-up shot or a wide-angle shot, or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, so basically everything that goes within the frame, the use of props, costumes, lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, things like music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, voiceover, the use of editing, narrative structure, the story elements within the narrative, and to things like visual motifs and symbolism. So as I mentioned, these basic building blocks of film language are really essential to establish pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, which is almost always less effective. And so depending on the age group or the academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students with a particular technique or element of the film to be on the lookout for, to report back in the post-screening classroom discussion, so that they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once, especially if these are students who might not have a lot of experience with film analysis. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the film in more detail now. I should mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the film, while still providing an overview of aspects for analysis that might help structure classroom discussion. Pigsy is a Taiwanese-produced Mandarin language science fiction animated feature about a youngish, dead-end computer operator named Pigsy living in the rundown world of Old Town, who dreams of escaping to this utopian new world with his grandmother. The film is an adaptation of that classic Journey to the West tale, and Pigsy is joined on his quest by a host of other misfit characters in their efforts to uncover the secrets of New World before they can be stopped by the villainous Bull Demon King. The film is very much an all-ages affair, riffing not just on Journey to the West, but also more recent works from Blade Runner through to Guardians of the Galaxy, balancing the film's vibrant visual design and energetic style of animation with social commentary about the role of corporations and technology in our lives. Okay, so just as an overview of some of the key themes and ideas that are explored throughout Pigsy, things like family and responsibility, issues of friendship and loyalty, there's nods to class inequalities, the influence of technology and corporations in our daily lives, questions of traditions versus progress, ideas of community, themes of home and happiness, and certainly within that, self-acceptance, I think, is a key talking point or issue. And this question of what does it mean to contribute to society or make you a contributor to society. I'll touch on some of these as I go throughout the presentation, but I think that gives you a fairly general idea of some of the kind of themes and issues that this film is exploring. Now, when approaching a film text, I often find it really useful to start from the big picture, from the outside, and gradually work in towards the detailed scenic or film analysis. And I do that because it's important for students to realize that art isn't created in a vacuum, that it responds to its cultural and historical moment, whether intentionally or unconsciously. And so placing a film within its various contexts are often a really helpful starting point for helping students understand a text on those deeper levels. And here a film like Pigsy explores a number of social themes relevant to contemporary Taiwan, to mainland China, and elsewhere around the globe, employing many of the tropes associated with science fiction. So certainly that would be one context you could look at the film through the lens of genre. And one of those key characteristics of science fiction is the way the genre, both in a literary or a cinematic context, often projects issues or anxieties of the present onto an imagined future. So here we have things like the impact of economic changes, the pressure to succeed, questions about an aging population, or indeed, more specifically, the social credit system. So depending on the age and the abilities of the students, these would provide a range of contexts or a lens through which to view the film or establish the film within its sort of contemporary moment. One of the other key contexts, which again I mentioned in the introduction, is of course the source text or inspiration for this film, Journey to the West. So if students aren't familiar with Journey to the West, unpacking Pigsy through the lens of its source material would be one possible approach to illuminating the text in a more contemporary context. So Pigsy, as I mentioned, is adapted from that classical 16th century Chinese novel, which details the pilgrimage of a Buddhist monk, Tang Sanzeng. I should apologize for my no doubt butchering of Mandarin. I'll mention that now as a disclaimer. Who, along with three protectors, Sun Wukong, Zhu Baizhe, and Sha Wujing, set off in search of these sacred texts and spiritual enlightenment. So there are obviously a number of key parallels just in the premise of Journey to the West that we see reflected in Pigsy. And this text has served as the source of inspiration for countless works of art, literature, stage plays, opera, film, television, comic books, as well as video game adaptations. If you're of an age, like me perhaps, then it's quite possible you grew up watching Sayuki or Monkey on the ABC way back when, from the 1970s. So the Japanese adaptation of this classical Chinese tale. That was certainly a very formative moment of popular culture in my youth. So again, a number of resources, and there's any number you could choose from. Wikipedia ones would be a starting point in terms of an overview of the text, or through the character of, say, Pigsy, or through a comparison of different types of adaptations, some of which students might be familiar with. And I've stumbled on a really great resource I think that could be valuable if you choose to pursue the film through this lens, and that is Journey to the West Research, which seems to cover the text from a variety of angles through its various adaptations. There's lots of interesting articles and so on that website, so that could be a useful starting point for further analysis and classroom discussion. One of the other possible contexts or angles to frame this film through in the classroom discussion and analysis would be through the film's production background and the director Li Wei-Chu. So interviews with the director or people associated with the production, I think, might help to enhance students' understanding of the creative process and the filmmaker's creative intentions for the film. Now, one of the key things I always tell students is that a writer or a director's creative intentions aren't the only way of reading a film, but they often provide a useful springboard for discussion. Questions like, did the filmmaker meet their intentions? Was their intentions the same way that you interpreted the film? Does our understanding of, say, a director or a writer's intentions change the way we interpret a film? And I've stumbled on a handful of interviews with Chu, who talks about the film in different ways. In one interview, they say, Pigsy is not your classic hero tale. Instead, it catapults an ancient myth into a fantastical future to tell a comedy adventure story about a nobody learning what it means to grow up. And this other one I think was interesting because it touches on some of those earlier contexts that I've already mentioned. And Chu says, I wanted to create somebody like us. We work so hard to make money because more money will lead to a better life. I think that's crazy. The rent of apartments is very, very high in Taipei, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Tokyo. We earn money just so we can stay in the new world, to prove that we are not losers. But we actually have a choice. There's no one path that we all must follow. I wanted to create a character that tells that story. And I've listed the links to both Variety and Winter Film Awards, where I've taken those excerpts from those interviews. And you could certainly access either of those interviews where the director talks about various other aspects of the film's production as well, certainly in that classroom context. Another approach would be to look at the film through the lens of form and style, in this case, animation. So Pigsy uses a combination of 2D and 3D computer animation in order to tell its story. So students could consider some of the following questions. For instance, why might a filmmaker use animation rather than live action to tell this story? How does the difference between live action and animation change an audience's relationship to a film? Is it just a simple case of animation is for kids and live action is for adults? I certainly hope that students would disagree with that. But prompting students to think about the questions of form and style in relation to storytelling. I think questions of animation also tie back into questions of culture. So what kinds of reactions or associations or cultural connotations does this particular style of animation evoke? How does the animation style within this film differ from, say, other styles? The classical Disney 2D animation, the hand-drawn, hand-painted animation, or more contemporary studios like Pixar, or Aardman Studios in the UK, famous for their sort of stop-motion, clay-motion animation, or a studio like Studio Ghibli in Japan. Are certain styles of animation tied to particular cultures? Does this film reflect a Taiwanese or a Chinese style of animation? And asking students to think of what sequences within the film stood out in terms of their particular use of animation. Okay, so moving on now to the nuts and bolts of film analysis with the techniques that I outlined at the beginning. And this, as I mentioned, is really where students should be able to identify the technique and have a basic understanding of its function. For instance, the use of a close-up, a technique that's used to reveal detail, or in the case of a close-up of a character's face like we have here in terms of Pigsy, to provide an emotional connection through that intimate relationship between the camera or the frame and the audience, allowing the audience to really read the emotions of the character. Or inversely, say the wide-angle shot, which not only functions to give the audience context in terms of setting or location, but also has these emotional connotations. So for example, this wide-angle shot of Pigsy there, isolated within the frame by himself, sort of lit just through this sort of spotlight from the ceiling, exaggerating these connotations of isolation and loneliness. So again, these techniques have different connotations depending on the context within the narrative and how they're being used. But it's useful that students have a basic understanding of their function from a filmmaking perspective, how they contribute meaning in and through the relationship with the audience. Two other examples: a low-angle shot, where a camera shoots a subject from beneath, tends to exaggerate their power, which is exactly what we have here in this shot of the Bull Demon King. And the reverse shot, presumably from the Bull Demon King's perspective, looking back down at Pigsy, exaggerating his lack of status, his lack of power in this interaction with the sort of the villain antagonist figure. And there are obviously a number of other techniques that students should be mindful of as well. So the use of lighting. So here we have a shot on the upper left of Old World. Again, the use of the low-level lighting, emphasizing the sort of the darkness, this idea of the fallen world in a way. Lighting contributes to that in a way that if that was brightly lit, we would have a very different understanding of. Or just questions of composition. Where in the frame are characters positioned? And here we have Bull Demon King composed centrally, looking out, kind of out over his domain. There's a power relationship that's implicit in terms of where that character is positioned within the frame in relation to the setting. Again, a sort of a wide-angle shot in front of him. The use of focus. Again, the way a camera might shift focus to various details within the frame. And here we have a really good example of that, where in the deep background we have the grandmother figure at a moment of deep sort of emotional sadness, and in the foreground we have this framed photograph of her and a younger Pigsy. So the composition, the filmmaker is using this contrast between foreground and background to create almost a sort of an irony, a deliberate contrast or juxtaposition between the past and the present, between the character and her memory of what her relationship was before to this other character. Or the way in which the camera adopts certain characters' perspective through the use of, say, a point of view shot. And here we have the camera adopting the perspective of a key character, putting the audience literally in their shoes and using what we'd call a Dutch tilt, encouraging students to think about what it means to see the world not just through this character's eyes, but in this slanted position. What is that saying or suggesting about the world that they're viewing? Mise-en-scène is a really key concept in film analysis, and essentially it relates to all the various components of the visual design, from lighting, composition, props, costumes, etc., and how they work together to explore or convey aspects related to themes or to character, to the world that we're given a glimpse of. And here you could look at what is the impression of Old World that the film establishes at the beginning through the cityscape, the bright neon advertising dominated world, and then the lower rungs of Old World, the cold blues, the use of colour, the use of the traditional lanterns that we see within that world as well. What are the impressions or ideas or themes that are being presented in and through those various production elements, those design elements? And that goes for character as well. What impression do we get of, say, Pigsy from his bedroom, just from the objects and the way they're arranged, or the sort of the subtle hints that, he lives in a sort of a lower socioeconomic world, that his residence is sort of the cracks are starting to show. And, say, issues of costuming. You could focus even in on more sort of key details, say through the figure of the Bull Demon King, who is dressed in many ways like a cross between a matador and a general. So obviously the costume contributes to our understanding of this figure as he's sort of empowered. But there's also a degree of kind of irony implicit within that? The idea of having a bull dressed up as a matador. How does that shape our understanding of his character? And to themes of power, for example. Music is another key element that I think is often overlooked, and the film employs a number of musical sequences. So focusing in on those in particular, what do they reveal about characters such as Pigsy? For instance, this idea that he's perhaps a dreamer or a fantasist, that these musical sequences may be taking place in his imagination, or the way he sees the world through these sort of more highly stylized moments within the film. Or how do lyrics contribute to our understanding of the scene or the film or its themes more broadly? Now, one of the key songs that we hear within the film, Dust by Huawei, plays towards the end of the film. And I've taken this translation from the subtitles within the film itself. But if you could find the Mandarin lyrics, certainly for Mandarin students, that could be a task that you could set, having them translate the lyrics less literally, potentially. So you could certainly present these lyrics as they are here to the class and have them reflect on what the significance of the song and the lyrics are to the narrative and the film that they've just watched. So looking at some of the key themes within the film that I mentioned earlier, the theme of traditions is obviously really key, I think. So what cultural traditions are represented within the film? Obviously, this is a key component, again, for language studies. What might the film be saying about the kinds of traditions that may be lost, either through an aging population or through the influence of technology? And this becomes a sort of thematic drumbeat throughout the film. We see references to the Lunar New Year. We have questions about, or anxieties presented through the character of Pigsy, about the traditions that will be forgotten sooner or later. But there are also references to things like Mahjong that you could discuss in terms of its cultural significance, or to certain foods and their cultural significance as well, such as the bean buns that we see. The contrast between worlds and what each of these worlds represent will also serve as a point of discussion in that classroom analysis. So, though the film is predominantly set in Old Town, the film does make repeated references to the quote-unquote New World. And I think students could really consider the deeper meanings connected to this idea of the New World, either in reference to the film's source material, Journey to the West, these Buddhist notions of nirvana or enlightenment, or what New World represents for each of the different characters within the film. And again, you could bring that back to mise-en-scène and the visual presentation of these two contrasting worlds. How it's introduced from the character of Pigsy through his voiceover. I live in what they call Old Town, and as he's describing the conditions of Old Town, he says they've cancelled the urban renewal plan. Again, with that nod to various social and cultural themes. Or by contrast, certainly visually, the New World, the brightly lit sort of utopia, which is introduced to the audience through phrases like, let's get rid of the old-fashioned ways of thinking. New World has changed all the old things. So here these other themes and connections between, say, traditions are being linked in and through this interplay or conflict between these two worlds. There's the theme of technology and corporations. What might the film be suggesting about the influence or impact of technology on our lives as audience members, or the lives of the characters within the film? Have we become too reliant on technology? How does the film engage with contemporary debates regarding, say, the ethics of AI, to bring the film's themes back to a very pressing contemporary debate that's swirling at the moment? What role do corporations play in our lives, or the lives of the characters? And again, the film seems to make quite clear nods to the social credit system. And as I mentioned before, these questions about social contribution, which I'll touch on in just a moment. But one of the interesting things about technology, where I think you get two sides of the same coin, is on the one hand, the film does seem to warn about the dangers of relying on technology to a degree, but also has a sort of sympathy towards older forms of technology. So we have these robot creatures, these android creatures, which raises the question, maybe we're too quick to discard technology, to toss it out, to throw it, resign it to the trash heap, so to speak. And that technology maybe has a usefulness beyond what we're willing to acknowledge. I mean, as you'll notice, a number of these themes are interwoven and closely linked. So the themes of family and community are perhaps linked to other ideas such as traditions. But ideas associated with family and family responsibilities are consistent throughout the film. So how does the film define family, both in terms of, say, blood relatives, which comes through in the grandmother-Pigsy relationship, or through the surrogate family, the ragtag bunch of misfits thrown together? What conflicts result from the bonds of family? In what ways is family both a source of strength and potentially a burden? What lessons might the film be suggesting about family and each person's role within that group? And beyond that, what's the value of community as it's presented within the film? And as I mentioned just before, what is the film saying about the role each individual plays within a community? Who determines which contribution is valuable or not? And again, this connects us back to the theme of technology. What might the film be saying about appearances or misperceptions? Is having power shown to be a corrupting influence? How do various characters contribute or use their various powers or abilities within the film? So this becomes, again, a kind of key concern from Pigsy, from grandmother, to the various other characters. Do we rely on technology to determine who in fact is making the sort of quote-unquote best contribution? And in terms of bringing some of these questions and themes and issues back, and the visual style and the approach taken within the film to symbolism and motifs, the use of animals and creatures to tell this tale obviously is anchored within that very specific sort of context and cultural context of Journey to the West. But what culturally specific symbolism and meanings are attached to each of the creatures that we see within the film? How might those associations differ within, say, an Australian context? Does the film challenge or subvert some of the traditional meanings aligned with various characters? What anthropomorphic qualities do we bestow on, say, a pig or a bull or a monkey or a dragon? So this would be an aspect of the film that I think you could certainly tap into to play out and explore some of those deeper cultural meanings, and the way in which the film in particular maybe subverts or challenges or questions some of those as well. And without giving anything away, what lasting impression do the filmmakers leave us with at the end of the film? What's the tone of the ending? Is there a sense of resolution, or do doubts and ambiguities about the future persist? So again, putting the onus back on the students to offer their own interpretations about the end, and maybe to put themselves in the position of the filmmaker. What thoughts and ideas does the filmmaker want us to come away with? And lastly, in terms of bringing all this back, hopefully, together, a possible exercise or assessment task that you could set students, and I know this is particularly popular with language classes, is to encourage students to read and critically engage with published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own, either in English or, say, in Mandarin, drawing on their close analysis of the film and utilizing the kinds of terminology and techniques that I've outlined throughout the presentation. And here's one example that I've dug up from the web that you could look at in more detail. And this is from Candice McMillan of Seattle's Child, and she writes, "There are plenty of lessons to be learned from this recycled fable, but the true alluring components that make up Pigsy are the enticing visuals and modernized Aesopian quest that director Chu Li Wei has so thoughtfully brought to the big screen. The film moves quickly from scene to scene, and the world that the characters inhabit is truly larger than life. As the film nears its wild end, the action sequences double in size and scope, and the rock music feels straight out of an 80s chase sequence. To put it simply, Pigsy delivers on its epic action-adventure promise, while still strumming the heartstrings with its story of redemption and finding one's moral compass despite the temptation of wealth and happiness." So this is just one excerpt from a larger review that students could familiarize themselves with in terms of writing approaches. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, just head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you will find all the information and resources as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very pleasurable and educationally productive viewing at this year's festival. Thanks so much.